I don't buy anything American. I don't go to the States anymore.
Air Transat announced today it is suspending the last of its U.S. flights for the summer season.
With Canada-U.S. relations rapidly deteriorating since President Donald Trump took office for his second term, tensions have shown no signs of slowing down as Canadian travelers have increasingly boycotted travel to the U.S. in the past.
Something is shifting in North America. And it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not being shouted across podiums in Washington or debated in primetime panels. It is happening in booking systems, in airline boardrooms, and in the quiet decisions of everyday travelers who are simply choosing to go somewhere else. Canadian airlines are pulling back from the United States, and the numbers behind that decision are getting harder to ignore with every passing week. This is not a political statement. This is not a protest campaign organized on social media. This is revenue management reality, and revenue management does not lie. Air Transat confirmed this week that it is suspending the last of its U.S. summer routes. Flights from Montreal and Quebec City to Orlando and Fort Lauderdale are gradually winding down, not because of storms, not because of aircraft shortages, not because of mechanical issues or crew constraints, because demand is no longer strong enough to sustain them. That single sentence should be read carefully by anyone who tracks the economic relationship between Canada and the United States. Demand is no longer strong enough for routes that have operated reliably for decades, for destinations that Canadian travelers once booked almost automatically. The demand is gone and the aircraft are being moved elsewhere. Just days before Air Transat's announcement, WestJet made its own strategic adjustment. 15 city pairs between Canada and the United States removed in a single decision. 15 connections gone. When one airline trims a route, that can be explained away as seasonal adjustment, temporary rebalancing, routine network optimization. When multiple carriers cut back in the same week, that explanation stops working. What remains is a pattern, and patterns in the airline industry do not emerge by accident. Airlines are not political activists. They are data-driven businesses operating on margins so thin that every route decision is backed by months of load factor analysis, forward booking trends, pricing pressure modeling, and consumer sentiment data. Every cancellation reflects numbers on a screen. When those numbers weaken consistently enough to justify pulling aircraft off routes that have existed for decades, the signal is unambiguous. The market has moved. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Canadian tourism to the United States actually represented economically. For decades, the flow was automatic. Florida built its entire winter economy around it. Canadian snowbirds escaping brutal winters in Ontario and Quebec became a foundational pillar of the state's tourism infrastructure. Orlando theme parks built seasonal staffing models around Canadian families arriving during school breaks. Fort Lauderdale hotels constructed their revenue forecasts around retirees crossing the border for warmth. The pipeline was steady, reliable, and worth billions of dollars annually. Not millions, billions. Every year, that money flowed south through hotels, restaurants, shopping centers, cruise terminals, car rental companies, and entertainment venues that had come to depend on its arrival as reliably as they depended on the sun rising. That was the baseline. That was the assumption every business in that ecosystem built its model around, and that assumption is now breaking down in real time. Canadians are still traveling. That is the critical detail that gets lost when this story is covered as simply a decline in tourism numbers. Planes are still full, airports are still busy, Canadians are not staying home. The shock is not that they stopped flying. The shock is where they are choosing to fly instead. Air Transat is leaning deeper into European markets. The carrier is increasing capacity to North Africa and adding frequency to international sun destinations that compete directly with Florida and the American Southeast for the same traveler demographic. WestJet is reallocating the aircraft pulled from U.S. routes into international capacity. The total volume of Canadian air travel has not collapsed. It has been redirected. Capacity is not shrinking. It is moving away from the United States and toward everywhere else. That redirection is the story. When demand weakens in one market and strengthens in another, airlines follow the strength. The strength is no longer pointing south. The question that sits underneath all of this is the one that the airline booking data alone cannot fully answer. Why? Why has cross-border travel that was automatic for decades suddenly become discretionary? Several forces are converging simultaneously, and separating them cleanly is difficult, but each one is real and each one is measurable in its own way. Political tension between Canada and the United States has been escalating since President Donald Trump began his second term. The relationship between the two countries has deteriorated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Trade disputes have generated headlines that create economic uncertainty on both sides of the border. Tariff threats and counter-threats have introduced a layer of friction into a trading relationship that Canadians had come to regard as foundational to their economic stability. When people feel economically uncertain, discretionary spending adjusts. Travel is discretionary spending. The connection is direct. There is also a currency dimension that operates independently of politics but amplifies the effect. When the Canadian dollar weakens against the US dollar, spending in the United States becomes heavier on Canadian wallets in a way that does not require any ideological motivation to feel. A hotel room that cost a certain number of Canadian dollars 5 years ago costs more Canadian dollars today, not because the room has changed, but because the exchange rate has. A meal, a rental car, a theme park ticket, all of it compounds. The traveler doing the math in their head at the booking stage does not need to be making a political statement to conclude that the same travel budget goes further in Europe or the Caribbean than it does in Florida right now. The math does the persuading on its own. And then there is the psychological dimension, which is perhaps the most difficult to quantify but the easiest to see in the data. Consumer sentiment is a real economic force. When the narrative surrounding travel to a particular destination shifts from automatic and comfortable to something that requires more thought, more justification, or more conscious decision-making. Some portion of travelers who would have booked without thinking will now pause. Some of those who pause will book anyway. Some will not. Over millions of potential travelers, that shift in sentiment becomes measurable in load factors, forward bookings, and ultimately in the route decisions of airlines that have no interest in making political statements, but every interest in following where their customers want to go. Canadian travelers have increasingly boycotted travel to the US over the past year. That is not editorializing. That is the context Air Transat cited when explaining its route suspensions. Now think about the ripple effect moving through the American economy. If fewer Canadians land in Florida, hotel occupancy softens. When hotel occupancy softens, room prices adjust downward to compete for a smaller pool of travelers. When room prices fall, revenue per available room falls with them, and that number is the metric every hotel investor watches most closely. Restaurants near the major tourist corridors feel smaller dinner crowds on the nights when Canadian flights used to land. Tour operators see fewer group bookings. Cruise terminals in Fort Lauderdale and Miami process fewer Canadian embarkations. Rental car companies at Orlando and Tampa airports move fewer vehicles. Each of these businesses operates as a node in a chain reaction system where a reduction in one input produces measurable reductions across every connected output. Tourism is not one industry. It is dozens of industries that happen to share the same customer. And right now that customer is choosing a different destination. The adjustment happening inside airline network operation centers is worth examining carefully because it reveals the magnitude of what has changed. Schedules are planned months in advance. Aircraft assignments are made against forecasts developed over quarters. Crew bases are established around route structures that are expected to remain stable. Marketing budgets are allocated to drive demand on specific routes. When an airline cuts a route, it is not responding to last week's numbers. It is responding to a forward booking curve that has already shown enough weakness over enough months to justify dismantling an entire network structure that took years to build. WestJet did not cut 15 city pairs because of a bad week. Air Transat did not suspend its US summer routes because of a slow month. These decisions reflect a fundamental reassessment of where Canadian demand is going over a planning horizon that extends well into the future. That is not temporary panic. That is strategic repositioning based on a conviction that the weakness is structural rather than seasonal. The map is being redrawn in real time. European destinations are gaining Canadian frequency. North African sun destinations are receiving capacity that used to flow toward Florida. The Caribbean is absorbing travelers who would have gone to Orlando. Every route that gets added to an international destination and every route that gets cut from a US destination represents a dollar that used to flow south, now flowing in a different direction. Multiply that by the thousands of travelers on every flight. Multiply that by every flight that no longer operates, and the economic impact becomes measurable in numbers that dwarf anything a single policy announcement or diplomatic statement could address. Whether this becomes a temporary dip or a lasting structural shift in the relationship between Canadian tourism and the American economy depends entirely on what happens next in the political and trade relationship between the two countries. Airlines will follow demand wherever it goes. If the conditions that drove Canadian travelers away from US destinations change, forward bookings will reflect that change and aircraft will follow. If the conditions persist or worsen, the routes that have been cut will not return quickly. Network reconstruction takes time. Consumer habits once shifted do not reverse automatically. The travelers who discovered that Europe offers competitive pricing, comparable weather in the summer months, and a political environment that requires no conscious decision-making are not guaranteed to return to Florida simply because tariff headlines soften. One thing is no longer debatable: the flow of Canadian travelers to the United States is no longer automatic. The billions of dollars that used to move across the border on a schedule as reliable as the seasons are now being redirected. Airlines are not making political statements. They are reading their booking data and moving their aircraft accordingly. And right now, their aircraft are pointing away from the United States. When automatic patterns break, even quietly, the economic consequences echo far beyond the runway and far beyond the destinations that used to depend on their arrival. So here is the question that matters. Is this a temporary disruption that resolves when the political noise quiets down, or is Canada permanently redrawing its travel map away from the United States? Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe now, because the economic story unfolding between these two countries is just getting started.